In our fourth episode of Raybees Reviews, we'll be reviewing the legendary Witcher 3. Now, there isn't really much to be said that hasn't already been said about this game. The Witcher 3 is pretty much unanimously considered the godfather of modern RPGs, and one of, if not just simply, the greatest games of all time. It revolutionized open world and side quest writing, as well as breaking the mold for how diverse and detailed environmental design can be, among all of its other achievements. Safe to say, guys, some of its biggest accomplishments even hold up to this day, and I've routinely come across big AAA games that haven't been able to follow the template that The Witcher 3 has laid out for them. So to make things interesting, instead of doing just a traditional review, I'm going to break this game down into 10 categories and give you guys a score out of 10 for each of them and explain my reasoning. When all said and done, we'll tally up the scores and we'll rank it on my tier list here. Now, with all that being said, let's get right into it. Starting us off is the plot. The game's plot revolves around Geralt's hunt for his adoptive daughter Ciri, who's being chased by the Wild Hunt. These interdimensional elves are losing their world due to the White Frost, an apocalyptic world-ending blizzard, and they're trying to capture Ciri and harvest her space-time powers to counter it. The plot's basically a three-way cat-and-mouse game between Ciri running from the Wild Hunt and both the Hunt and Geralt trying to locate her before the other. Overall, I found this premise to be very compelling. The game does an excellent job of building up the Wild Hunt as these terrifying antagonists that are like literally killing anything in their path in order to secure Ciri for themselves. Geralt's journey across the different regions of Melin, Novigrad, and Skellige as he tries to keep up with Ciri is beautifully told, especially with the use of intelligent flashbacks to tell the story from both sides. Every time he would clean up a region and get some insight on her whereabouts, he finds out she's just left and headed towards even more danger, which keeps the stakes and tension very high. As well as he tries to hide it, you can literally feel Geralt's apprehension and dread as he learns more and more about the dangers that Ciri is being exposed to, and that creates a real sense of urgency of trying to find her before the Wild Hunt eventually catches up. The game is perhaps most famous for its unprecedented level of narrative agency, especially by 2015 standards. How the plot eventually resolves itself and Ciri's fate is directly tied to how you choose to interact with her as Geralt. I see these as sort of like parenting moments. The more faith you have in Ciri to take care of herself, the more resolute and confident she becomes in her final stand against the White Frost. By choosing not to baby her around and see her more than just her powers, you allow her to create faith in her abilities and the conviction necessary to survive. And it's not just the main story either. I was so shocked to see a game in 2015 have this kind of agency over simple random side quests that are completely missable. Choices you make during the side quests can have wildly different outcomes throughout the whole story, which is something I don't even see games from the modern day emulate. Although I can obviously appreciate a good linear story just as much as anyone else, having this kind of player agency over the game's plot takes things to a whole other level. It makes you feel like an active participant in the world, which at the end of the day is what ultimately separates games from mediums like books or movies. You can shape the course of the plot instead of just being an observer, and that's what makes games truly special, and The Witcher embodies that every sense of the word. As good as it is, The Witcher 3 plot does have some serious problems in terms of the ending payoffs, and the biggest of them being the Wild Hunt. While they were built up phenomenally well, they kind of fall off after the Battle of Kaer Morhen, and especially when Ciri's decided that she's had enough of this shit, it didn't really take much for Geralt to run ISO on all three of the Wild Hunt generals and kill them off one by one. In the climactic battle, he even killed the second strongest, Caranthir, who was essentially created to be a genetic replicant of Ciri's own teleporting abilities, and the big bad final boss Eredin in very quick succession of one another, which I found extremely jarring from a narrative point of view. While Caranthir and Eredin were definitely tough fights, I think the toughest fights in the game, I couldn't help but thinking, what specifically changed narratively to allow Geralt to just speedrun through them so quickly? The whole game was built around finding Ciri, but given how the ending played out, I couldn't help thinking why Geralt didn't simply switch strats and just start picking off the Wild Hunt commanders instead. From a narrative perspective, I think Kaer Morhen should have been the final stand against the Wild Hunt. Instead of going on this wild goose chase for the other mages and the Sunstone that destroys a lot of the pacing, I would have liked it if there were dedicated missions to just killing each general. Something that happened to Imrahil, but also for Caranthir as well. It should have felt like the heroes were beating the Wild Hunt systematically through a concerted approach to constantly weaken Eredin before baiting him in and facing off with him one-on-one. This would have also fixed some of the pacing issues that the game suffers from. While the initial part of Velen and later parts of Skellige are done nicely, the Novigrad arc and the final Mage Assembly arc felt really bloated and unnecessarily long. Novigrad especially took the wind out of my sails because it takes so much time just running back and forth to rescue Dandelion, only for him to drop 2 fucking sentences on where Ciri is and just go on his way. I felt like the pacing could have been a lot closer to Skellige's arc if that was all we were going to get. So overall guys, I think I'm going to give the plot of Witcher 3 a 7 out of 10. It has a compelling premise, excellent storytelling and use of flashbacks, masterful tension building, and extremely good narrative agency to immerse the player into the story. However, despite all of these feats, the pacing is good for half the playthrough, and the ending feels extremely contrived, underwritten, and just honestly sorta unsatisfying for the most part, so I have to talk some points there. Moving on from the plot, let's talk about the characters in The Witcher 3. One of the best things about The Witcher 3 are the initial characterizations. Every single character is quite memorable because they're not written like cardboard cutouts, but actual people with feelings, motives, and nuances. If you're like me and most other people who've never played the first two games or ever plan on reading the books, having this kind of characterization is important because while you may not understand the context of everything that's going on, you can understand the human emotions behind these characters, which is incredibly powerful and honestly kind of underrated. Having strong, relatable, and memorable characters help new players ease into the really complex lore of the Witcher series without overwhelming them with the backstory, the names of people, how the universe works, and all the intricacies behind the political plays. The best thing about the character arcs in The Witcher 3 is actually the supporting cast who play a massive role in shaping the story and making it feel more human. Characters like the Bloody Baron, Dijkstra, and Krak, not to mention all the rest of the minor characters that were written with such attention to detail that they practically just jump off the screen. Whether it's the Bloody Baron's heartfelt redemption, Dijkstra's constant political screaming and wisecracking, and the battle between the children of Krak to be the next ruler of Skellige, The Witcher 3 is excellent at making these characters feel like compelling human beings. Even random NPCs from throwaway quests and simple Witcher contracts all have compelling arcs and have genuinely impactful, relatable stories, which is honestly ludicrous to consider given the time period that this game came out in. And this is something to note here, guys, because CDPR kinda fumbles the main cast. Part of the reason why the final arcs feel so underwhelming is because Geralt doesn't really go through any sort of character development, other than simply learning to trust in Ciri. I feel like he's more of an anchor to the story than a traditional MC that goes through a real arc. The only difference at the end is he's basically treating Ciri her own age now. This is also why the side character arcs feel so impactful. It's because they were desperately making up for the vacuum left by Geralt. They're the ones that make the stories in the game feel impactful and genuine, while Geralt doesn't really change as a result of his experiences, which honestly I'm not really a big fan of. And Ciri's character arc is actually even worse. I feel like she's already a finished product at the start of the game and easily the most overpowered in combat. Her whole arc of being seen as just more than her powers was very good in theory and maybe even decently executed, but the underwhelming fourth quarter of the plot, as well as the weird nature of how she confronts the White Frost, didn't really land for me, and it ended up fucking up her arc as well. Earlier in the video, my reasoning behind Ciri's arc was that if Geralt gives her the room to make her own choices, she gains the resolve and confidence to face the White Frost and survive. But the truth is, guys, that's just my interpretation, and honestly, it's a bit of reach. What does her being more confident in her abilities have to do with surviving a multi-dimensional world-ending blizzard? I can see what the devs were going for, but the writing is very, very murky on this front. The two lead, again, sort of act like anchors while all the people around them are changing, evolving, and overall just contributing to the arcs of the story. Maybe this is just an unpopular opinion, but I think that's conceited writing for the most part. I would have liked to see Geralt and Ciri go through the same kind of arcs and become appreciably different by the end of the game, because it isn't very narratively interesting to play characters with very little development that can just plot armor their way through the story. It sort of breaks the human immersion that the game has built up so well with its supporting cast. Even though I feel like I should give it a lower score, I'm going to give the character arcs in The Witcher 3 a 7 out of 10. Mostly off the back of powerful characterizations, compelling interpersonal conflicts, and an enormously impactful supporting cast that all go through individually unique arcs that make the game feel very lived in, despite CDPR fumbling the arcs of its main leads. Coming straight from the plot and characters, let's talk about something that's equally as important when it comes to the game's emotional footprint, and that's the incredible voice acting in The Witcher 3. Literally everyone from top to bottom is spinning on all cylinders with their vocal performances this game, and that's what makes it feel so genuine. Depending on what region you're in, you can actually feel the general mood and countenance of the NPCs depending on how each state is faring in the war. My all-time personal favorite Witcher 3 character has to be Dijkstra.
Think for once. They scooped out your balls, not your brain.
It's been a bit of a while since my last playthrough, and I forgot just how brilliantly his dialogue is written and how well he's voice acted, because every time he's on screen, I swear to God, he completely just steals the show with how fucking funny he is. Now, as much as I hate to say it, I think it's actually the American voice actors that kind of fumble the ball here. Geralt, Trist, and Lambert were certainly not up to par with the other cast, and the performance fall-off was very noticeable, especially for Trist. As much as I found Yennefer annoying as hell, I couldn't bring myself into the Triss romance path simply because she sounds like such a basic bitch, like an honest-to-God valley girl. I understand Geralt has his senses dulled by the Witcher mutations and isn't quite as emotionally expressive, but goddamn is he completely dry and just straight up underperform in certain scenes.
Hear my call and arise, Dea.
I feel like the dry wit excuse will work most of the time, but his performance sometimes slacks off even in some of the big scenes that require heart and emotion to be fused into the story, which I honestly found kind of disappointing. But ultimately guys, these are fairly small problems in what's otherwise an extremely good voice acting performance from everyone across the board, so I'll be giving this section a 9 out of 10. Moving on from the narrative section guys, we'll focus on the sensory portion of the review, starting with the visuals. And the visuals in The Witcher 3, especially by 2015 standards, are fucking extraordinary. Just the sweeping shots of landscapes and how different they are from one another is truly remarkable compared to what games were doing back in those days. From the fields of Velen that are ravaged by war, to the medieval metropolis that is Novigrad, and the traditionalist Viking culture of Skellige, The Witcher 3 has damn near pioneered environmental storytelling on a scale that just wasn't really done before. Just the feeling you get when you're riding around all these different landscapes and environments with their very realistic terrain and biome diversity was such a fucking massive accomplishment back in 2015. And you add to this the character and monster design, and the world quickly becomes a living, breathing organism. And that's what makes this game stand out even after all these years. It's just the culmination of all these little things that consistently go the extra mile that truly make this game feel alive and breathing. And even just aside from the environmental work, the visual effects of like casting the different sign animations to big boss attacks and the famous sword finishers all add that extra flourish and flair that even makes the combat itself very exciting and genuinely immersive. Even the little stuff like the different icons in the inventory and especially the armor design are all hand-drawn. It may seem like such a little thing, but it makes such a pretty big difference when it comes to actually immersing yourself into the story. It's like we're going through the inventory ourselves and picking apart all these different items. If there's anything that The Witcher 3 nails, it's that the little stuff always matters. Cinematically, although it looks dated by now, by 2050 standards it was still very good. The camera direction, whether it's small, more intimate scenes or huge scale fights, was really good and important in capturing a lot of the gravitas that the premise and the story demanded. The game is extremely cinematic heavy, even the small quests have their own dedicated cutscenes, and so nailing this does wonders for engaging the player with the content and allow them to actually experience the narrative instead of just like skipping through the dialogue. Honestly guys, I can go on and on about Witcher 3 visuals forever, but I'm just going to cut it short and give this an 11 out of 10. Moving on from the visuals, let's talk about the audio and sound, where the game just continues to go from strength to strength. The Witcher 3 probably has one of the most famous soundtracks in video game history. The main themes perfectly capture every single aspect this game is built on, from the mysticism to the danger and all the different people of its land. It's not only insanely compelling and catchy, but also layered just beautifully. Whether you're just taking a ride through Novigrad, walking into a lively tavern in Skellige, or cutting up some water hags, The Witcher 3 has a song for everything, and that's truly remarkable. As much as I can appreciate a game using silence properly, the clever integration of music and sound in The Witcher 3 really does make it feel like there's a sound and jingle for literally everything that girl does. See guys, there's a difference between having good music and layering the tracks together with the visuals, and it's a completely different thing to actively support the visuals with just the perfect bit of auditory storytelling, and I think The Witcher 3 is one of the best games at it. And the standout for me is obviously the combat music. Literally everyone can recognize the Silver for Monsters song, and every time I hear it in Velen, it really does get my fucking blood pumping when I square up. It just gives you that perfect hit of adrenaline and makes the combat encounters that much more immersive and really does drive up the fantasy. Honestly guys, there's not much to say here. Literally everyone has heaped praise on The Witcher 3 soundtrack, and I'm no exception, so I'm just gonna give this a perfect 10 out of 10. By the way guys, if you guys are enjoying the video so far, like the video to boost it to other people who might also enjoy this kind of review style, and subscribe to get my reviews in your feed sooner. Let me know what you think of my scores so far, and what you would personally give the game for each of the categories we've discussed so far. And now, back to the video. With the sensory section wrapped up, let's get into the game design of The Witcher 3, starting with the combat. Now, I think I'm a bit of a minority in this department because I generally found the combat to be quite exciting. Granted, it is basic as shit, and I can probably play it with my toes if I hooked up some extra controls, but it's genuinely a fun combat loop. There's quite a bit of variety in how you can choose to build out your Geralt, from focusing on spamming basics, to more on the signs, or even relying on potions and other consumables to overpower your ops. Aside from these random ass moments where NPCs just start perma-blocking for some reason because I think they reach the edge of some invisible wall, the feel of the combat is generally really nice. The dismemberment especially is something I really like, and I wish more games like Ghost of Tsushima had this mechanic. It seriously drops up the immersion during the combat where you're just like slicing things up and watching limbs just go flying across the fucking screen. While it may not exactly be the most skill-reliant combat system imaginable, it certainly gets points for just pure dumb fun. I'm also generally a huge fan of the enemy variety. They can have very unique skill sets, and in theory, how you deal with them is a large part of the combat experience. We'll get into this later in the systems category, but I think the game sort of fumbles this aspect in execution, but in theory they had the right idea with all these different kind of monsters you can fight. The only real problem I had with the combat are the boss fights. Now, outside of Caranthir and Eredin, which I genuinely found compelling and intense, the rest of the boss fights were honestly kinda shit. There's not enough attack animation variety between the bosses, so you just have to watch out for the most basic of wind-ups and sweeps and just like hop away from it. It's actually so bad that I think the visuals and the music carries the experience more than the actual bosses themselves. Given all that, I think I'll be giving the combat in The Witcher 3 a 7 out of 10. It gets points for just dumb fun, build and enemy variety, but loses points for depth and lack of truly intense boss fights that have to serve as capstones for major story arcs. Free from the combat, let's move on to the progression systems, which is definitely The Witcher 3's worst category. Probably the biggest problem I have with the game systems in The Witcher 3 is that most of the systems are straight up just non-existent for regular difficulty players, like they might as well be just disabled from the game. It's so easy to the point where players simply aren't incentivized to engage with the deeper Witcher systems like the potions, oils, decoctions, or even just reading the bestiary. They can simply spam basic attacks through the entire game and would be completely blind to these interesting and honestly immersive systems they can use to actually feel like a Witcher. Potions, oils, bombs, and decoctions, and just like the general preparation, are supposed to be part of the Witcher fantasy, but on normal difficulty, the game is just so easy that you even forget they exist. This is actually such a serious mistake in terms of the game design because it means you are essentially punished for being a normal person and picking the regular difficulty by having some very fun and immersive parts of the experience just cut off from you without you even knowing. I know it's common advice by now to just play on harder difficulty, and while I do agree with it, especially since I tortured myself for you guys and played on standard, I think it's important to hold the devs accountable for essentially delivering an undercooked and frankly unrewarding combat experience. As players, we're sort of trusting devs to nail the Goldilocks zone of difficulty and challenging us enough to interact with all of the game systems, so I really hold it against them when they fail to deliver on this very basic and very important promise. Because, guys, think of it like this. What if The Witcher 4 comes out and we're still telling people, remember to play on higher difficulty? Most people are just going to end up picking normal difficulty, so that normal difficulty has to be challenging enough for the average person while still giving them incentive to use all the systems. Another problem I had was the general skill tree. Now, I'll be honest guys, even if I sat my ass down and focused, I don't think I could come up with the worst skill tree in my entire life. It's way too constrictive and really kills off any sense of progression and fun because you're so capped on how much you can invest into it at any given time, which is a critical failing on one of the most basic pillars of designing a fucking skill tree. There are so many times I just had skill points just piling up waiting to be used and I couldn't use them until a fucking slot opened up. Again, I know the DLCs fix all of these issues, but once again guys, do you want The Witcher 4 to come out and have to wait another 1 to 2 years before a DLC comes around to fix these issues? No, so let's hold the base game accountable because I don't want to wait for the DLCs to fully enjoy Witcher 4 when it drops. And perhaps the last problem I have from a system standpoint is that there is just way too much bloat. Most of the armor and weapons and just generally everything is fucking useless, and I just didn't like how overloaded your inventory can become. When there's bloat like this on a very systematic scale, each item loses its significance, which is not really a good thing for the player. Honestly, it makes you feel like a garbage collector more than an actual Witcher, and again, this is a massive failing on the design part. Even though I personally like stuff like the Witcher sense mechanic and it helped drive the tension during the investigations, having to use it a lot and just highlighting all of the surrounding items in the environment just made me realize how bloated and useless most of the looting system was because there's just so much shit. But all the negatives out of the way, I think generally everything else is pretty stock standard. I know this category just turned into a bit of a vent, but I don't want that to take away from everything the game does well from a system standpoint, like the Witcher senses or just nailing the progression curve from a simple armor and weapon standpoint. The very basic stuff is done well, and that serves as a foundation, but I'm just annoyed that the more interesting bits and pieces are hidden behind a poor difficulty curve that's just invisible to the vast majority of players. And even though I want to, I honestly don't think I can justify dropping the score more than a 5 out of 10, so that's where I'll leave it. Moving on from its worst category, let's talk about the best category in The Witcher 3, which is the world design. The Witcher 3 might just have the best world design in gaming history. I think this was the biggest reason why this game is like universally lauded as the game of its decade, because of how revolutionary the open world design is. Every single region feels like its own distinct country, complete with unique architecture, cultures, politics, and just general atmosphere. Berlin, for instance, is miserable and ravaged by war. Novigrad is like the medieval fantasy version of Los Angeles, in both good and the bad. And Skellige has this very remarkable Nordic backdrop. But perhaps the most impressive part about The Witcher 3 world design is how the side quests, especially just the random ones you find, are written. To this day, I haven't seen world immersion to that degree. Before The Witcher 3, open world content was quite linear and kind of empty, filled with repetitive fetch quests that just seemed like they just padded runtime. The Witcher 3 redefined what we expected from open worlds and their side content by increasing both the scope and the detail. There are tons of meaningful short stories with their own plot arcs and dedicated cutscenes that all have real impact on your playthrough. You're constantly just stumbling into people's problems, secrets, and tragedies, and you're forced to make decisions that don't always have a happy ending. What other games routinely get wrong, and even the big ones, is that the context behind these smaller tier 3 quests are usually so underwritten that there isn't enough world immersion or stakes to take them seriously. You have to understand, guys, without context or a reason to care, a lot of these quests just become busy work. The Witcher 3 side quests genuinely feel like a collection of interconnected human stories that immerse you into Geralt's story and the world at large. It's extremely humanizing because while Geralt is losing his fucking mind trying to find Ciri, the world reminds you that his problem isn't the only one in the world and there are tons of other people going through similar problems in the middle of the war and the invasion of the Wild Hunt. After finishing my Witcher 3 playthrough, I actually started playing God of War 2018 to prep for that review, and almost instantly I was so shocked by how the tier 3 quests in that game just felt kind of like boring and uninspiring compared to the standard that was set by a game that came out 3 years before God of War. And keep in mind, guys, this is God of War 2018 we're talking about, the game of the year and like a bona fide classic. It really goes to show you how transcendent The Witcher 3 was in this particular category. Modern games still miss that mark 11 fucking years later. If there is one problem I have with the world design, and honestly it's just not a small nitpick, is how unrewarding the exploration can feel most of the time. I've already said this in the last category, but it's worth repeating here. While The Witcher 3 Senses is a nifty mechanic, and I really like how it can even turn some basic boring missions into mini Sherlock cases, it also just shows how much useless shit is just lying around in the world. If you have OCD like me, you're gonna run around and empty out all the barrels picking up everything, knowing full well this shit is like completely useless and isn't ever gonna see any use, especially with like how the difficulty curve is that we also talked about in the last section. It's a case of just having way too much item bloat, which counterintuitively reduces the excitement and fun of exploring this world, because the vast majority of the time the items are just fucking inconsequential. However, that isn't enough to dock major points on how unprecedented the scale and detail of the open world was for The Witcher 3, so I'm going to give this world design an 11 out of 10. It's the primary driving factor on why The Witcher 3 is universally praised for more than a decade straight, and I feel like anything else would not be doing it justice. Moving on from the game design, let's finish off with the subjective category, starting with quality of life. My biggest problem in this category, and one that has been talked to death by now, is the traversal. Both Geralt and Roach are just way too fucking fast with very limited maneuverability, so I was constantly getting stuck in places while just trying to literally move around. It became so fucking annoying at times that I literally stopped using Roach and just started running on foot. I noticed that even the smallest fucking thing on the ground can completely stop Roach in her tracks, and the process of like reversing her and looping her back around genuinely took entire minutes. Another gripe I have with the game are the fucking unskippable cutscenes every time I would load a save or go to a new region. It was genuinely cool the first time it happened, and honestly it's cool like every time I log into a new session, but literally every time I reload or change regions, that's way too annoying, and it sometimes really makes the playthrough pedantic because I'm just sitting here listening to the same bullshit recap over and over again. I know it's such a small thing, but it's crazy how big of a pain point that was for me. I definitely hope they don't pull some shit like this in the sequel. But other than that, guys, I think the game is pretty clean in terms of quality of life. There's quest markers, fast travel, and enough help that you don't need to ever go out of your way to learn some like obscure mechanic or some way to beat a boss that isn't mentioned in the bestiary. So all in all, I'm just going to give this category a 7 out of 10. And for overall enjoyability, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. The Witcher 3 is essentially the quintessential RPG and absolutely deserves its reputation as one of the greatest games ever made. It's probably the best example of using video games as a medium to completely immerse the player into a fantasy world with painstaking attention to detail and flawless execution of sensory integration. It's basically like the godfather to modern day RPGs like KCD or Ghost of Tsushima because it revolutionized the importance of carefully building a real world around the RPG experience so the gameplay doesn't devolve into a fucking soulless combat progression simulator like Gothic Remake. Basically every single game that came after it looks for Witcher 3 for like inspiration, and the vast majority of them still don't even come close to replicating it. Although it falls short of its own lofty standards when it comes to like ending, fully fleshed character arcs, and a botched difficulty curve, it still remains the industry's enduring standard for how video games should be made. And with all that glazing out of the way, let's add up the scores. Plot, 7 out of 10. Characters, 7 out of 10. Voice acting, 9 out of 10. Visuals, 11 out of 10. Audio, 10 out of 10. Combat, 7 out of 10. Progression and systems, 5 out of 10. Open world, 11 out of 10. Quality of life, 7 out of 10. And overall enjoyability, 8 out of 10. With an overall score of 82 out of 100. Now, this is a bit of a problem here, guys, because this is the same exact score that Ghost of Tsushima got during its review. Since both of them have the same score, I'm going to actually break the tie by comparing enjoyability scores, where Ghost of Tsushima wins out with a 9 out of 10 compared to The Witcher 3's 8 out of 10. And there you guys have it, my full Witcher 3 rundown. Now, it's your turn. What do you think of the review, and what do you think of the scores I've given to each of the categories? Detail them out in the comments below, and let's see how your final scores compare to mine. While you're down there, like the video to boost it to other people who also enjoy this kind of review style, and subscribe to catch my reviews every single Sunday. If you guys want to watch all my other reviews, I'll leave the full playlist here for you guys, along with my Ghost of Tsushima review. I'll catch you guys there. Peace.